Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of baseball, which has been known for a very long time as America's national game. And just to kind of get you set up for what that means, I imagine many of you attended a professional baseball game this summer. This was actually one of the few summers that we didn't go. Usually we go to Cincinnati game because that's where one of our kids lives and enjoy a game there. And they're a lot of fun to go to. It's usually something we try to do on vacation. And people from all over the country enjoy baseball, and actually all over the world. But how did it become America's national game? Let's start by watching a video that kind of displays what baseball means to Americans. And this movie clip is from the movie Field of Dreams. Can't remember what year the movie was, but Kevin Costner is one of the stars. Story of a farmer in Iowa who's about to lose his farm, and he keeps hearing this voice that says, if you build it, they will come. He will come. And eventually he knocks down corn in his field and creates a baseball field, and is even encouraged during this time by this voice to find this Terrence Mann, who was a writer who he finds in Boston, I believe, comes back with him to the farm. And in this clip, his brother-in-law, who is the banker who holds the mortgage for the farm, is telling him he needs to sell the farm so that he doesn't lose his shirt. And Terrence Mann has something to say about that. So let's take a look.
The fact remains is that you don't have the money to bring the mortgage up to date, so you're still going to have to sell. I'm sorry. We got no choice.
Ray, people will come, Ray.
They'll come to Iowa for reasons they can't even fathom. They'll turn up your driveway, not knowing for sure why they're doing it. They'll arrive at your door as innocent as children, longing for the past. Of course, we won't mind if you look around, you say. It's only $20 per person. They'll pass over the money without even thinking about it. For it is money they have, and peace they lack.
Ray, just sign the papers.
They'll walk out to the bleachers, sit in shirt sleeves on a perfect afternoon. They'll find they have reserved seats somewhere along one of the baselines, where they sat when they were children and cheered their heroes. And they'll watch the game. And it'll be as if they dipped themselves in magic waters. The memories will be so thick they'll have to brush them away from their faces.
Ray, when the bank opens in the morning, they'll foreclose.
People will come, Ray.
You're broke, Ray. You sell now or you lose everything.
The one constant through all the years, Ray, has been baseball. America is ruled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time. This field, this game, is a part of our past, Ray. It reminds us of all that once was good, and it could be again. Oh, people will come, Ray. People will most definitely come.
Ray, you will lose everything. You will be evicted. Come on, Ray.
And that actually, that last player there that you see, that is in the movie, it is Kevin Costner's father when he was younger. My husband and I, one summer, actually took as part of our summer vacation, going back to visit family in Iowa, we stopped off at that farm where the field for Field of Dreams still exists. But the speech that Terrence Mann gave right there just shows some of the things he said, talks about how important baseball has been to the history of the United States. So, if we look at how baseball got its start, it actually began as a fraternity game. Remember our fraternities, the fancies, baseball was one of those things. And when it got started, the goal of baseball, playing baseball, was simply for personal pleasure. Had nothing to do with having spectators or money, being famous, anything like that. Had everything to do with just some enjoyment for the men who played. And they got their satisfaction that they were missing in their work. We have this time period during the mid 1850s, 60s, or during this time period, people are moving into factories and they're losing their meaning, their enjoyment, their satisfaction that they were getting in their work. And so baseball was a place to get that. It was also a place where they got emotional support, companionship, a sense of belonging. And so many of you have been on teams. You know that's part of being part of a team, are those friendships that you make. People that I used to run with, they're our close friends even to this day. And it was also a place for them to be able to display their physical skills. Because, before we had the factories, when people were doing crafts work and that sort of thing, they were showing things and creating things at that time that showed individual creativity. And once the factory started, that wasn't being able to be showed, so they couldn't show any individual kind of, stand out in any way. And with baseball, those who played and were able to display their physical skills, that gave them a way to stand out in something. So these goals that are very different, some of them are the same as today, but obviously there's some very different ones too. It shaped the game back then. So very much different from what was happening in prize fighting and these pedestrian races. First of all, when baseball was a fraternity game, it revolved around organized clubs. And these clubs were both athletic and social organizations. So this was not just, I'm here to play baseball and that's it. No, this was part of their social life. And so this was where they got their friendships and stuff. And for the young men, remember, many of the factory workers, people living in the cities, were young single men. It provided them some kind of satisfaction, again, the companionship, the belonging, and the ability to show their skills. A big part of these fraternities, these clubs, were the dinners and dances that accompanied them. And, even if a game was advertised, I think your book talked about a game being publicized in the newspaper, how it was more of the article talked about what was happening in the social event, how the team arrived, what they did socially, than the game themselves. So those dinners and dances were very, very important. And the game, while it had some similarities to what we see today, it also had some very important differences. Some of the rule differences that we saw were that there were no balls or strikes called. And umpires, if there were any, did very little. They only came into play when there was something, a dispute that couldn't be solved. They didn't use gloves. Gloves didn't start coming around until around the 1870s. And if a catcher would to catch a ball off of one bounce, the person was out. It didn't have to be caught on a fly, and that was partly because of the fact that they weren't using gloves. There was an underhand pitch by the pitcher, and they were supposed to be gentle tosses. So the batter would tell the pitcher, okay, here's where I want you to pitch the ball, and this is where I want to hit it, so that he could hit it. There wasn't an attempt to get rid of it. And in order to help us understand the game a little bit, let's watch this video of a historical society that put together a baseball league. I think it was from the 1860s, but let's see.
Like Ray Kinsella looking out at his cornfield, Edward Baker had a vision during a visit to Fort Trumbull State Park in New London.
I looked down at this field and I said, wow, has anyone ever played baseball here?
That idea 10 years ago led Baker, then executive director of the New London County Historical Society, to found a vintage baseball team.
Part of the motivation for getting the club started under the sponsorship of the New London County Historical Society was so that we could get some younger volunteers involved in the Historical Society and to share history in a different way than what we usually do.
Well, we play by rules from 1861, and there are several major differences. First is that the pitcher has to pitch underhand. Balls caught on one bounce are outs. We don't have gloves. Those came started to come in the 1870s, so we play barehanded.
You gotta take a little pain with the broken fingers and stuff. Just the ability to be able to reach down onto the ground without a glove, when you have that glove on, it adds another 6 or 7 inches when you bend down for those ground balls, so.
You need to have some give in your hands. You need to bring it toward your body, and if your hands are going toward the ball and you're trying to catch it, there's a very strong chance it's just going to bounce off.
Clearly in the middle of the 19th century, the men's club aspect of baseball was really primary. I've read some newspaper accounts of a match between two clubs in 1865 here in New London, and the newspaper spends more time talking about the arrival of the club at the wharf on the steamboat that came from Mystic, and then the parade of the teams from the wharf to downtown, and then the dinner after the games, and the speeches that were made after the games, and so it was clearly, well, this is just a game, and we're going to have fun, and we're here to be together. And I think that is an important part of what is the game's attractive today.
Back then, it was still considered a gentleman's game. If you got called out at a base and the player knew that you were safe, he would raise his hand and say, "Mr. Umpire, I'd like to call him safe." It's not like today's baseball, the big business. We like to get back to when it was a friendly game and the camaraderie was there.
3 cheers for our Dames Baseball Club. Hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah! Great match, guys.
So you can see how the game was very different back then when it was run by the fraternities. And these teams or clubs were organized along occupations, maybe. So maybe the blacksmiths of the area had a team, or maybe people who worked in this factory had a team, or whatever. It might also have been organized around ethnic groups, so that the Irish might have a team, the Swedes might have a team, the Germans have a team, or it might be along the neighborhood ties. So people who lived in this area of the city have a team. The press really encouraged the growth. There were accounts of, like we heard on the film, accounts of what the teams were like and how they did things socially as well as in the game. This particular journalist by the name of Henry Chadwick was very important to promoting baseball. And in fact, they called him Father Chadwick mostly because he ended up editing the first baseball guidebook. He invented the box score and batting averages, and so newspapers started reporting those things as well as more of the social events. And you need to understand that the myth that baseball was invented by Abner Doubleday is indeed a myth. It was created in order to make it more of a national game in the 1850s. And that's because we're leading up to the Civil War during that time. And so there are tensions between the North and the South and particular areas of the country. And so this was one way people thought, well, if we can have this game that's just an American game. So they made up this story that baseball was made up by Abner Doubleday and it's strictly American. And you know that parts of it came from cricket and stuff. And so it's not a totally new game, but that's how it was promoted. They wanted that national unity. But despite this, it still wasn't a respectable type of sport to many Americans. So it was kind of like prize fighting, but prize fighting didn't really want the respect. Baseball did. And baseball tried to point out that it was consistent with Victorian values. They said, oh, it encourages self-control, keeps the youth out of trouble, it's a moral thing, blah, 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 blah. Things we hear about sport today, yet. And, but you know what? With the players, not so much. This was the organizers trying to do that. As baseball moved more and more from the fraternity game into an organized commercial thing, we see less and less consistency with the Victorian values and things like we saw on the video, this idea of being nice to each other and stuff. You start to see that go away when baseball started to move to a commercial enterprise. So commercial enterprise. So it's more like moving more to what we see today. And it's got its start somewhere around Brooklyn with something called the enclosure movement. And that simply meant that we're putting up fences around fields and we're charging a fee. Okay, before it was open, like we see on the video, like we saw on the video, and there are other videos you can see online of early baseball games where it's totally open and everybody just walks in and watches the game. And now we're just totally used to the idea that you have to pay money to see a game. And you can't see it unless you pay this money and get into the park. And that's an enclosure. And this enclosure movement got started. So they put up these fences, started putting up bleachers and stuff. They were trying to make money. People saw how popular baseball was and said, why don't we start charging money for people who attend these games? They love it so much, they'll fork over some money. And they also used it to promote and display pride in the city. Again, we see that today. Minnesota Twins, Chicago White Sox, the Cubs, Cincinnati, all these different teams. You see jerseys around all over the place. I used to live in Atlanta. I had my jersey there. So, I mean, it was something that you had pride in with your city. And some of the changes that took place with baseball becoming more commercial were things like gate charges, okay? Again, so we're paying a fee to see a game. Because of that, they wanted to make more money, so they started to play more games. We actually saw this in more recent years when we started to extend the playoff system for baseball teams. And because clubs wanted to win and make more money, they started to practice more. It wasn't just, hey, show up and let's play. It was, let's have practice first and then let's do it. The teams were cohesive. They started staying together longer, so they would go on these tours during the summer, going to different cities. Actually started to recruit players, trying to find the best players for their team. And, so in order to recruit players, some of them even started giving secret payments to star players. Maybe they weren't being paid before, but now, hey, you come over to us. I used to play for Cincinnati. Come over to us. Hey, we'll give you $1,000 or something. That was probably a lot during that time, but maybe 500 or so, maybe 100. I don't know, but it was that sort of thing started to happen. Fans started to become extremely attached to their teams, and you actually get the term fan is short for fanatic. And that's what you start to see with this. They start to gamble on games. And in fact, there's even some players starting to fix games because they can make more money by maybe losing a game or whatever the case is than winning a game. And even with the fans, if they saw, behavior was awful at these games. If they saw that they were going to lose a game and thus lose their bet, they might actually, before the game was done, rush the field and end up getting the game called so that they wouldn't end up losing a bet. And so it was pretty rough going there. And so we have the Victorian press. They are condemning player behavior and saying how awful it is and how unruly these players are and so forth. We'll talk about their actual behavior in a little bit, but still the game became very popular. More and more people started to say, hey, this looks like a lot of fun. It was popular with players, popular with fans. It allowed the players to display their skill, their aggressiveness, and their machoism. And we start to see these professional teams developing from these city rivalries, which, as we said before, it allowed for the promotion of particular cities. And the first professional league started in 1871 and went through 1875, called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. Now, look carefully at the name, a National Association of Professional Baseball Players. We're going to see that change as it goes along. So this association of professional baseball players lasted from 1871 to 1875. These are the professional leagues, professional teams that developed. But then this league ended in 1875, and in 1876, a new league was formed called the the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. And you might want to write down that whole name, National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. Difference? Before it was about the players, now it's about the clubs. And this new league didn't allow clubs that were owned by players like the previous one did. That's a very, very important difference. So now we got the players are just playing, and the clubs are being owned by other people who are running it and trying to make money. Right? So, this new league, like we saw before, still wanting Victorian approval. So they did some particular things in order to do that. They banned Sunday games, didn't allow games to be played on Sunday. They prohibited the sale of liquor, which is one thing that didn't go over very well. And they charged 50 cents per game. Now that was a lot of money back then. Now this league, 5 years later, it was challenged by the American Association. And this association got started when the team in Cincinnati, they were being told by the National League that they couldn't sell liquor, that they couldn't play Sunday games, but Cincinnati wanted to keep doing both. And they kept doing both. And so they were kicked out of the National League, and so they started their own league. So Cincinnati started this. It was called the Beer Ball League for a nickname. And you can guess why, because they sold liquor at the games, they charged less for admission, and they played on Sundays. So everything that the National League wasn't doing, well, the American Association was. They had a strong competition with the National League. And it ended up that because, I mean, they competed strongly for fans, they competed very strongly for players, and in fact, some players, as your book talked about, players were playing in this American Association League because they didn't like what was going on in the National League, and the National League tried to woo them away with higher salaries, and some players even said, look, no, you know what, I'm not going to leave my boys. I'm going to stand with them. So had a strong competition. So the National League ended up making some agreements with the association, American Association, and led to a truce. And they actually kind of combined together, although you still see clearly this league and that league, the teams. You see the association, the American Association teams versus the National League teams, even though they were competing with each other then. And during this time period was the American economy was very strong, and because of that, that was one big reason why interest in baseball really increased. People could afford, when the economy's good, just like today, people can afford to go to games, and so the game starts to grow even more. So you have this tension between teams of the American Association and the National League, and the idea that we didn't want, the National League didn't like the American Association as far as what it stood for and stuff. So you have that conflict. But then you also have something come up called the Players' Revolt. And during this time period, around the 1880s, there was a conflict between club management and players. The owners wanted their players to be sober, well rested, very disciplined players. They were looking for that Victorian approval. Okay? The players, on the other hand, they were working class men for the most part. And so they were used to drinking, fighting to show their machoism. They gambled. They were mostly single men, and they had no wife at home, I guess, to kind of rein them in. And drinking especially was a conflict between these two. The players and management also disagreed about salaries. And, you know, players, hey, baseball was becoming more popular. The club, more people are going to games, so the clubs are getting more money from people attending games. And so players are thinking, hey, we want a piece of this. Why aren't we getting paid more? And so they disagreed about their salaries. The club had some very important weapons to their advantage in this conflict. Number one, they just tried, first of all, to admonish their players, okay? Well, you know, that didn't go very far with the players. Yeah, don't drink and don't gamble, don't fight. Yeah, that was going to help. They would fine their players for inappropriate behaviors. Sometimes that would work, sometimes it wouldn't. They started to blacklist players. That meant that they refused to hire players that were dismissed from other clubs for any other reason. So, if Ted over here got dismissed from the Atlanta team for unruly behavior, there was a gentleman's agreement that said, hey, the team in Chicago can't hire him, won't hire him. That's a pretty strong way to keep your players in check. There was also something called the reserve clause. This meant that a player could only play for the team that first signed him. Okay, so again, if Ted when he first started to play baseball, if Atlanta was the team that first signed him, that was the only team he could ever play for. That was the reserve clause. Well, if that happens, what if you want more money? Okay, so what can I do? If I want more money, and this is the only team I can play for, if I'm any good, if I'm like one of the star players, I might be able to hold out. So I'm not going to play until I get more money. Okay, that might work if I'm a star player. But that didn't really work a whole lot, because really you could get good players a lot of different places. So that didn't work. They could quit baseball. That was the only other option. But that wasn't a good option, because really they could make more money playing baseball than they could with other things, even though they weren't getting paid what they were worth according to what the clubs were making. So that reserve clause was a very important weapon used by the clubs. Also, they sold other players to other clubs. So what happens is that one player, Ted, again, could be sold to Chicago for a certain amount of money, which meant that, I mean, the player had no bargaining power. That could just happen without, if he didn't want to go to Chicago, so what? We'll sell you. If you don't want to go to Chicago, you know, your only option is to quit. Doesn't matter how much they're paying you up there. And so, you know, it was a lot like slavery. And, you know, that was something actually we were trying to fight against and had fought against during the Civil War. So the players were being compensated for skills that the owners were being compensated for the skills that players had. So that wasn't very fair. So what happened in 1890, the players, this was what the revolt actually was, the Players' Revolt. The players formed the Players' League. And they did that when the management started to, they tried to impose this $2,500 salary ceiling, so nobody could make more than $2,500 in a year. And the players wanted more money because baseball was very, very popular. And in this new league, so some of the players that were playing in the previous National League, they went and formed this new league where there was joint management by players and investors. So maybe a bank invested in it, but players did it as well. So they were working together in this endeavor. The problem with the league, unfortunately, I mean, the league got some of the better players from the other side, from the other league. The Players League got some of the better players from the National League. And so that was good. The problem why it didn't last and it wasn't successful, it only lasted for one season, was because they started having games on the same day in the same city as the National League. Okay, so you're competing for the same fans. And they started to have rules where they were looking for Victorian approval. So in other words, they had rules where there was no beer sales at the games, no Sunday games. So that didn't win them any more fans than what was happening before. And they also charged as high a fee for the fans as was happening with the National League. And so what was going to be an advantage to going to the Players League games? Albert Spalding, during this time, he was the sporting goods entrepreneur. Yes, the guy that you see, the Spalding name that you see on sporting equipment all over. He was actually against the Players League, and he supported the National League, and he made deals with the Players League backers to do it in, essentially. So he was kind of on the sly, and those backers that we talked about, the joint management by players and investors, he went to the investors and said, you know, I don't know what kind of deals he made, but he made them some deals where they weren't supporting the Players League anymore, and so the players were kind of sitting on their own, and so it only lasted a year. But that players' revolt was very important because they were trying to do something. Let me back it up. The players were trying to do something where they would get paid fairly for what they were worth. And today we have players associations who look after player rights. These are more successful in some of the professional sports than others, but back then this was kind of a start to that. And although it didn't end up being successful, it at least got people's attention. Now, think back to the video, what you saw in the game. We start to see some changes happening in the game when it starts to become more commercialized and professional. And these changes were designed to make the game more attractive to the fans. Okay, we're trying to make money. So, how do we make the game better? They started to have overhand pitching. Because of that, they lengthened the pitching distance. That ended up with the overhand throw harder on a person's arm. I don't know if we got any pitchers in here, former pitchers, but that's going to end up creating this rotation of pitchers. Before it was always just one player pitching. Could have been anybody, I guess, in the team. Now you start to have more specialization, and the pitchers, we do the rotation. During this time period, we start to see the walk coming into play. And actually, the umpires are going to start to become more important because you have to have somebody looking at the strike zone and saying, okay, that was ball, that was a strike. Any 4 pitches outside the strike zone ended up in the walk. That started during the late 1800s, making it more appealing. Actually putting a lot of strategy on the pitcher. some new tactics started to develop. So infield started to back away from the base. That should say base, not based. So in other words, they're not just standing right on the base. They started to go, stand a few steps, places away from the base. The catcher started to move closer to the plate. Before, they just stood way back, waiting for the pitch to come to them. Now they started to move closer so they could catch it sooner. Also because of that overhand pitch. The outfielders started to back each other up. So you start to see that happening. So that's more offensive type strategies. Gloves came into being around the 1870s, 80s. That started to be, somebody developed the glove, and then it started to be actually legal during the game to use. And offensive teamwork. Above was defense. Offensive teamwork, you start to see the hit and run being developed. How do you make hits into extra bases? And even base stealing came into play. Started to look more like the game what we see today. And the psychological tactics. Yelling, talking under your breath at people, yelling at other players, your mama, whatever. Just trying to get into their head. The game was still very violent. Players were learning to slide into base, wearing spikes, and so they tried to purposely hurt other players. That was part of that as well. So, during the late 1800s, as we said before, baseball really grew in popularity. The people loved the game. Your common folk loved the game, but it did not gain much respectability. Was looking for that Victorian respect, didn't really ever get it. Because, number one, we have violence in the game, as we just talked about. The bleachers were actually quite dangerous. They might have been put up very quickly with very weak materials, and oftentimes you would have them breaking in the middle of games because of the number of people sitting on them. So that could be dangerous. The fans, by the way, did you read in your book how the bleachers got their name? The boards that were created for the stands, as they called them, when they were put out into the sun, which many of the seats were, they eventually became bleached by the sun, and so they ended up to be called bleachers. Do you ever see that? Fans were particularly men and middle class. You saw very few females at the game. Your upper class Victorians didn't really care for the game, and so they didn't like that. There was also a generation gap. The older generation who tended to fall, this makes sense, tended to follow the older values, the Victorian values. They didn't care for baseball. It was the younger generation that really liked it. And we start to see baseball moving overseas. Now, how does that happen? It was the icon of American culture, so it was promoted as such, started to be promoted like that in the 1850s, and it became seen as, okay, this is American. So what happened when Americans started to go to other countries? First of all, we see it in Cuba. That's the first international country that it went to. They enjoyed the game, so Americans who went there, they taught them the game, they enjoyed it, they thought it was a nice pastime. But at that time, during the 1800s, Cuba was ruled by the Spanish. And it was one of those kind of subtle, but not so subtle ways of being a protest against the Spanish rule. We're going to play an American game. We're going to ignore your Spanish pastimes. because we don't like you. We like the Americans, and thus we're going to play their game. So, in your face. It then moved, the Cubans then moved the game to other countries, as well as Americans going to these other countries, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Dominican Republic, and obviously today that we get many of our very good American and National League players from these countries. And that got its start way back in the 1800s. So baseball, the American game, eventually moved to be international. So those are our beginnings of baseball. Later on in the semester, we'll talk about what it looks like today and in various ways, and some of the heroes of baseball. So we'll look forward to that as well.